who is coming from the University of Birmingham. And Francis is here to share with us his work on low-cost source apportionment of air pollution, a study that he has been conducting in collaboration between Makerere University and Birmingham University. And here at Makerere, AirQo is the major partner. This work is a component of the environmental pollution program, which is implemented in partnership with the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution, but it's supported by the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs of the UK government. So this component has other subcomponents in the program. I'm expecting some colleagues from AirQo, and also expect some online participation from GAHP and other participants who are online. So on behalf of the Department of Chemistry and on behalf of Makerere University, I take this opportunity to welcome you all to this lecture. And before Francis gives his talk, I'm going to give a few minutes to the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution to say a few words about the EPP program in Uganda, and also a representative from AirQo to say a few words about the activities and their collaboration with Francis Pope. So on behalf of the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution, let us welcome the Executive Director, Maria Paula Leah, to give a few remarks on behalf of GAHP, and then on behalf of AirQo, we shall give a few remarks to Dr. Deo Okule, who is also online. Maria, you're welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Professor Tebanda, for hosting the webinar today and this lecture, and thanks a lot to Francis Pope for being there with you. I'll be very quick because you mentioned already a number of items, and I think we want to hear a lot about the work that Francis is implementing with your colleagues on Makerere University. But I'll briefly introduce GAHP, who we are, and a few words about the EPP program, because as you mentioned, this is just one component of an overall program that we are implementing in Uganda. So for those of you who do not know GAHP, we are a Swiss foundation based in Switzerland, working to address the health impacts of pollution with prevalence in low and middle income countries. Our two main components of work are advocacy and awareness raising. So we do this in different ways by participating in various expert working groups at international level, but also building and strengthening capacity of civil society on the ground, and we do country support. So that means we partner with low and middle income countries to support them prioritizing their pollution agenda, which is the case now in Uganda. So why do we work on this issue? Why we work on pollution? We know that globally, unfortunately, pollution creates 9 million deaths, which is actually 16% of all deaths worldwide, and a very high number when you compare it with, diseases that affect low and middle income countries and that maybe are very well known because those are infectious diseases. When you compare it with TB, HIV, and malaria, and you look at the prevalence and numbers, you see that pollution actually is a bigger killer. And even so, the aid funds and development assistance are very limited. When we look at funds and intervention on pollution, you see that the level of finances that goes here is very little. And why do we work in low and middle income countries? It's because unfortunately 92% of those deaths occur in low and middle income countries. So we believe that it's by creating data that we can create the justification to attract the necessary resources for country to invest in aid, but also for low and middle income countries to see what is the cost of inaction. So typically the study that Professor Pope is doing, it's something that can feed into this concept very well. And in fact, we believe as GAHP that building political willingness, but also capacity, local capacity, and creating data are, at the core of a theory of change to make sure that, there shouldn't be so many deaths and diseases caused by pollution. In Uganda, as Emmanuel mentioned, we are convening the environmental pollution program. So this is a set of initiatives which includes a number of research. The first one we will be doing is conduct a review of Uganda waste management and agricultural policy, with of course our angle, which is health. So how much pollution is impacting health in this area, but also looking at them with the eyes of gender equity, disability, and social inclusion. I invite participants who do not speak to.
Sorry for the interruption. Please unmute. You're muted. Please unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. So the second intervention is what we call the Health and Pollution Action Plan, which is a process convened by GAHP, but which is pretty much owned by the country where we're working. So in this case, in Uganda, we work collaboratively with NEMA, your Ministry of Environment, but also Ministry of Health, Public Sector, and Academia, and Makerere University is one of the partners. To prioritize the pollution agenda of your government, and then create a roadmap of practical intervention to address what we believe, what your government believes that is impacting health outcomes the most. As part of this program, there is also the study that Dr. Pope, Professor Pope is carrying on. And so on traffic-related air pollution in Kampala, and this is happening in collaboration with your university to try to feed on, new data, and not just on the quantity of air pollution, but also, on the source of pollution, so that actually practical and low-cost intervention can be planned. And because, as I mentioned, we believe it's important to work with local communities, we will be also partnering with civil society organization to implement advocacy campaign linked to this pollution agenda. And last but not least, we will be implementing an economic study on the cost of inaction looking at pollution, because as I mentioned, this is a process that is really meant for your government to own. And we would like to provide information and data to show what is the cost of inaction if Uganda cannot or won't invest in certain aspects related to pollution. So thanks a lot for your attention. I'm very pleased to have Dr. Pop presenting to you all, and I hope there will be fruitful exchanges, and we're all looking forward to see the outcome of these very interesting studies. Thank you.
A hand clap to Maria for that overview of the EPP. Thank you, Maria, for that overview. Next, we have a few remarks from a representative from AirQo, and these are going to be given by Deo. I'm sure Deo is online. Yes.
Can you confirm if you can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, greetings everybody, and thanks for putting together this session today. My name is Deo Kure, and I coordinate research and global partnerships at AirQo. Prepared a few slides. Let's share my screen here. I don't know if this is visible to all.
Yes, it is visible.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I just want to focus on the sort of the big picture here in terms of how we can be able to move towards realizing a cleaner future, not just in Uganda, but in Africa, but looking at an integrated approach that includes data, of course, data for action and policy. And to do this, I've chosen to focus on some insights from one of the studies we did a few years ago, that's a scoping review that looks at 20 years of air quality management in Africa. In this work, we sought to answer about 5 questions really, understanding one, what interventions were developed or implemented in the continent between the period of 2000 and 2019. And 2, who was involved in developing these interventions and whether these interventions were assessed effectiveness or whether the effectiveness on health outcomes were assessed, and of course then unintended consequences. So what's most important is kind of understanding, looking at the emerging themes from the scoping review. We had 3 major themes here in terms of the intervention. I'll talk about the breakdown shortly. So one, that in terms of tackling air pollution, all the interventions, and we looked at interventions very, very broadly to look at any, any actions taken that could potentially have an impact on air quality, whether that was the primary motive or, unintended, but just kind of more broadly to look at anything that was undertaken within this period that could have direct influence on air quality. So technology comes out at the top at 75% in terms of what was done, policy 20%, and behavioral change, including education and awareness efforts, at just 5%. But let's look at the breakdown of what that actually means. So if we tried, when we dissect this, this is what the 75% actually meant, that most of the work that was happening on the continent, about 86% of the 75% were initiatives around cleaner cooking, which I believe many people might be familiar with, and obviously household energy, about 8%, and air quality management technologies. And this includes air quality monitoring, which I believe is center in today's conversation, about just 4%. So more globally, you're looking at of all the interventions, this 4% translates to 3% of efforts towards air quality monitoring, which I believe is also consistent with what other people, had been finding. And obviously, and of course, green mobility at just 2%. So you see, if you're looking at areas where we need to, direct our efforts, I think this was, very much instructive in terms of where the opportunities are for action, for intervention. Moving on to policy, we found that most of the interventions actually represented a mix between air quality management, control, enable legislation for investment, and so on and so on. Obviously, policy here, in a very broad sense, because policy is not just the paperwork exercise, it's not just the legislation. It's both what is spoken, what is intended, the actions taken, or even what is, what is communicated. So that, presenting a mix of all those different pieces, constituting about 20% of what was done. So that meant that, from year 2000 until 2020 and 2019, you're looking at most of the efforts around air quality, just under 20%, which I believe is also consistent with the amount of evidence we're generating locally, given that if you're looking at translating local evidence and data to policy, if you don't have much in terms of the data, the evidence, and the science, you're not going to have so much to talk about in terms of policy, other than obviously some of the unintended, some of the core benefits from other policy initiatives. And then, of course, awareness constituting about 5% of the interventions. So that also explains why I think in the public arena, the importance placed on air quality could still be low, because we've not done much work to raise the profile of air quality, or to raise a public agenda, or to ensure that there is more public participation. If you think about an example, if, for example, government raises taxes, there is always uproar, and there's been lots of cases where, because of public uproar, because of agitation, somehow you see governments, not just in Uganda, I'm talking here more broadly, there'll always be there can be a rollback on some of the on new policies. I believe Makerere is also could be very familiar with this. Whenever in our time, whenever there is something to do with raising school fees, people there'll be an uproar. But it's very rare that you'll find, with all the numbers that you know today about air quality, about air pollution, it doesn't seem to bother us so much as the general public. But that's partly because we've not done a lot of work. There's not been much work done to make this a priority, to make this appear as something very, very important. And maybe this is why a project like this would come in, would be very useful to try to close that gap. I am going to summarize with some reflection points here, that in order for us to realize clean air goals, I think we need many things to happen almost at the same time. And that is coordination across sectors, across disciplines, across borders. And yet what we see, even from the study, is that these interventions are not always commensurate with what actually happens on ground in terms of pollution exposure. The second point really is that we have seen across the continent, different cities, most of the challenges that we see in Uganda, or in Kenya, or in Cameroon, or think of any African city, you find that these challenges are largely shared. The good news there, that means that we could be able to replicate some of the success stories, or we can have these shared learnings across borders, because we largely have really shared problems, whether it's energy, whether it's mobility challenges, or name them. And some of these are listed as follows. Access to monitoring data is still a challenge. In terms of collaborations across sectors, we still see there are silos. Of course, there's been lots of effort to try to close these gaps, but the silos still remain very visible, that in many respects, we cannot tend to operate in silos. And this is largely not intended, but this tends to happen. Then, of course, a limited participation and policy development, perspective policy development. I'm not sure whether how many people in the room are familiar with the air quality regulations in Uganda that France, Emmanuel and myself we are fortunate, we are privileged to be part of in a prominent capacity. But again, that participation, you see that tends to be lacking, in that this becomes, an undertaking of a mandated entity, and then that is expected to be complied with by the regulated sector or the public. So I think there's opportunity for us to kind of, shift the narrative to make sure that these initiatives actually are developed to address the needs of the people. And then, of course, the elephant in the room is that some of these resources to have such robust programs very prohibitively inaccessible for countries on the continent. Just to transition to what hopefully Francis will be talking about in terms of using, low-cost approaches. One thing that is evident, and this is what AirQo has really been contributing towards as well, is leveraging emerging technologies, particularly local sensors, to close the data gaps. But again, just kind of more globally looking at the evolving landscape and what this actually means in terms of having an optimal system for air quality monitoring. Again, just very globally here, the emergence of local sensors. Yeah, I did this work to look at how the scientific outputs over a 20-year period from 2003 until 2020, 2004 to 2023, on what from the scientific community in terms of peer-reviewed publications, how the trajectory in terms of the utility of local sensors, and this was giving about annual growth of about 26%. But you can see that there is strong recognition and there's a significant uptake in terms of the utility application of local sensors found, in various areas, whether it's to just quantify the distribution of pollution or understanding the spatial variations, or or maybe what France is doing today on the low cost so understanding source apportionment. But I think this presents a huge opportunity, and what we've demonstrated with AirQo in being able to use this side by side with reference monitors, we are able to quantify, at least have some semblance of data in data hungry cities, where in some cases you find that first local sensor you deploy is actually even the only data point available for the city. So I think I did want to kind of highlight the fact that there's a huge opportunity in leveraging some of these technologies to move the needle, to shift the narrative in terms of tackling air pollution. And maybe for people who might not be very familiar, and we summarize this in one of the earlier papers in trying to appreciate what actually low cost means. So in pictures on the left-hand side, you have a complete setup of a monitoring station, and this is taken from DC, where you have a collection of reference monitors looking at different parameters. Then on the right-hand side, and that's my right, you have this compressed this compact local pair of local sensors. These are AirQo sensors, but just kind of looking at illustration of the difference in terms of how we're moving from that to this, and this can be a huge difference. But in terms of the numbers, really, I do not think there is a definitive threshold of what actually entails this, but I think fairly anything below 2,500 would really fit in this category. And this can be very accessible because you're talking about, in Uganda shillings, about 10 billion shillings. That for 10 million shillings, you could have access, you could have data, you could be able to generate data on at least 2 parameters of pollution. So if you could, have this across different cities, if you have maybe 10 of these per city, with one reference monitor, it seems like having an air quality network could actually be a reality. And on the other hand, having $30,000 to procure one reference monitor and to monitor one parameter, that can be a bit out of reach for a country or a setting where resources, you have to deal with other competing priorities. And I do want to stop here and say that there is a lot more work to be done, and there's a lot of opportunities that we can be able to leverage from existing initiatives, including the data we're collecting. So we more than welcome the research community to use this data to tell our own story in terms of what needs to be done or how much the problem is and how we can move forward. Thank you very much, and wishing you good deliberations.
Join me to thank Dale for the highlight that he has given us from the work done by AirQo. And in the interest of time, we're going to cross straight to our main event of the day, which is the talk from Professor Francis Pope. And yes. As highlighted before, Francis Pope is from the University of Birmingham. He is actively involved in research in areas of air pollution, climate change, and sustainable cities. He has done a lot of work in collaboration with AirQo. Please join me to welcome Francis to give us his talk.
Excellent. Well, good morning, all. It's wonderful to be back in Uganda. I haven't been to Uganda since pre-COVID, so I think the last time I was here was 2019. But as ever, the welcome's been lovely, so thank you very much. And it's great to see people online as well, especially Dio and Maria Paolo. So really nice to see you online as well. So I've been asked to give a talk about low-cost source apportionment, or LoCoSA is the acronym we've given it, of air pollution. And this relates to this project I'll talk about at the end, but we've only just started this project. So I'll show what the idea behind the project is, and I'll give you background to work we've been doing in Birmingham and elsewhere before, and then I'll talk about what the project will be. And we were hoping that Dimitrios Bousiotis would also be giving the presentation with me, but actually he's out in the field now, so he's setting stuff up. So it's me doing the talky stuff, he's doing the actual work. And the other thing I should notice is, are you mostly chemists in the room? Yeah, okay, excellent. So I was trained as a chemist. So my undergraduate was chemistry, my PhD was chemistry, and then I'm now in an environmental sciences department, but I know a little about chemistry. And I should say thanks straight away at the start to GAHP for brokering the funding and being a key project partner. Also say thanks to the UK International Development, and also say a really, really big thank you to Makerere University for hosting an AirQo, and I'll mention some of their work as we go through. Okay. Excellent. So the slides have got a little bit messed up, but it's fine, I think. So Maria Paolo's also already talked about air pollution and health, and I'm sure if you've come to this talk, you already know that air pollution is globally, it's the second leading environmental risk factor on public health. It's responsible to up to 9 million premature deaths per year. But that only tells, those headline statistics only tell something about it. So it's not just that people are dying prematurely, it's meaning that they can't work so hard, it means productivity goes down, it means children's educations are curtailed, it means just a break on the economy as a whole. So it's, it really is one of the biggest problems in the world at the moment. Causes more deaths than AIDS, causes more deaths than wars and famine at the moment. It affects us. Obviously, we breathe it in, affects our respiratory system, but once it gets into our lungs, it gets into the cardiovascular system as well. And once it gets into that, it can get into all the organs in the body. So essentially, if you read the literature, there's not an organ in the body which air pollution doesn't affect. Some work I also do, I won't talk about it much today, but we've got a series of work in Birmingham where we're looking about the effects of air pollution on cognition. So there's this growing body of work which shows that air pollution not only affects our physical health, but it also affects our brain health. And put very simply, we can think about air pollution reducing our IQ, not by a lot, but enough to be measurable, okay? So at an individual level, it's maybe not so important. Maybe it knocks 1 or 2 IQ points off us. But at a population level, that's really significant. So if you're aspiring to be a high-tech country, you want your workforce to be, as bright as possible. So I think we'll hear a lot more about the effects of air pollution on brain health as we go through. And I've got this was from a newspaper article. I don't know if you can read this. This was for a few years ago, but what it says is air pollution rots our brains. So is that why we do nothing about it? So I quite like that. So if you want me to talk about that, I can talk about air pollution and cognition another day. Okay, so more what this talks about. So air pollution management. And I won't go into the policy side, which Dio very elegantly talked about before, and the winning hearts and minds side of it, which is super important. You know, we can't just research air pollution. But if we want to know about how to manage air pollution, there's essentially 3 main points to it. We have to be able to measure how much air pollution there is. And here there's been really great strides over the last few years. So we need to know outside that window, how high is the particulate matter air pollution? Is it, I think it is about 30 micrograms of PM 2.5 today, which is unhealthy, not desperately unhealthy, but it is unhealthy. So we need to be able to measure it. And in the last decade, everyone, or lots and lots of people have really pushed forward on that. And so we've got much better capabilities there to doing that. The second step, and this is really what this talks about today, is not only do we need to know how much air pollution there is, but where does it come from? So this is what we call source apportionment. So of those 30 micrograms of PM 2.5 particulate matter outside, where does it come from? So maybe I can ask the room now. So where's the air pollution coming from as I stand here at Makerere University? Where's it coming from? Where do we think it's coming from? From industries? Yep. Yeah, absolutely. That's a big one. Anything else? Construction's a big one. You said road as well. So actually those two things are both big things. Obviously lots of pollution from transport, but also construction in general. Yep. One more time, sorry. Vehicle emissions, absolutely. And so that's very much what this GAHP project's looking at, is vehicle emissions. And as I took my Boda Boda this morning, you know, in the traffic jams, you know, clearly Kampala, wonderful city, but you do have traffic problems. There's no getting around it, right? And so clearly in that rush hour between, you know, and it's a really long rush hour, you know, from about 7 in the morning to 11 in the morning. And so clearly you have lots and lots of pollution from air pollution, from traffic. So traffic is a big one. And then, so we need to know how much air pollution there is. We need to know where it comes from. And then once we have these things, we can start to model it. And that's that final point. We need air quality models. And that allows us to then get into that policy side. We can start to think about, well, if we reduce, how can we reduce air pollution? Should we provide public transport? Should we provide cleaner industries? But you can start to do this. But if it turns out that industry is only responsible for, I don't know, let's say industry is responsible for 10% of air pollution in Kampala, but traffic's responsible for 50%, then that suggests we could go for traffic first. So I won't talk much more about modeling, but clearly that's the important bit of it. So requires measurements of air pollution. And so AirQo here, I really need to give a big shout out to AirQo here, is, you know, so what AirQo have done, as Dio says, is they've set up this network of sensors for air quality within Kampala and actually all across Africa now. Really impressive. And, you know, they're not the only team in town. There's other people. There's Breathe London, for example. There's Indian ones. But I really would argue that AirQo here in Makerere are leading the pack. They really are doing the best work in setting up these sensor networks. And it is incredibly impressive. And so this high resolution measurement of air quality is super important. We can see how air pollution varies across the city. We can see how it varies for the times of the day, and we can start to think about personal exposure from that. Okay, so typically in the past, we used to have, how did we measure air pollution? So we had these expensive regulatory grade equipment. And so the story I always tell is when I was back doing my PhD in the chemistry department, to measure air pollution, the piece of kit was as big as this lectern, you know, and it cost lots and lots of money, maybe £500,000. And it was very beautiful. It was very shiny. It was very good, gave really accurate data, gave really precise data, but there's only one of them in the country. So we couldn't measure anywhere. So it was beautiful, but it wasn't very useful. Okay. And now there's been this real revolution in these low-cost sensors. And Dio mentioned that low cost kind of goes from anything from $10 to, you know, maybe up to £10,000, depending exactly. But if we think about the old pieces of equipment, these really expensive bits of equipment, Now we can buy something, maybe it's about the size of my phone, maybe it costs $100, and we can now put these all around our city so we can get much more information out. So there's been this, and I don't think a revolution is too strong a word. There really has been this revolution in how we monitor air pollution. So now we can monitor air pollution in many more locations than we used to at much greater resolution. And so before I get on to that, so AirQo is doing this great job in Kampala, and so they've been measuring air pollution in Kampala for maybe the last 10 years or so. So how has air pollution changed in Kampala and East Africa in general? And so this is one of the really difficult things to answer because there aren't really any historic records. So there's some satellite data, but not really anything very useful within the last, which goes back beyond 10 years. So this is an old project of mine, but I think it's quite interesting. So you can use visibility as a proxy for air pollution. And the nice thing about visibility is just how far I can see. Okay, so can I see that mountain? That mountain's 40 kilometers away. If I can't see it, then the visibility is less than 40 kilometers. Can I see that tower? No, that tower's 10 kilometers away. So that gives you this range of visibility. But the nice thing about visibility is where you have international airports, there's a measurement of visibility going back to the 50s, maybe, at least to the 70s. And so what we've got here on this slide is that's visibility in Kampala, but also Nairobi in the red and Addis Ababa in the green. And what you can see is visibility is over the decades. This is going from 1975 to 2020. What you can see is visibility on average. It varies day to day, but if we average over a whole year, it's decreased, and it's decreased quite significantly. And so if we then turn that into a pollution index, this is a very crude way of doing it, but if we put that into a pollution index and we say in the 70s, pollution was, we just put that as 1, so it's unity. And so how does it look back in the 2010s? This is slightly old work, so it hasn't got the most recent. And what we can see if we look at Kampala, which is this one here, is what we can see is the amount of pollution in Kampala has increased by at least 250% since the 70s. So we're rapidly getting more polluted, cities getting bigger, people are doing more polluting activities. With some of these things comes benefits. You know, it's a richer country, it's a richer capital. But in terms of pollution, it's got worse. So we can do this very crude backwards look at air pollution. But then we want to really get much more information than just this 1 point per city. So this is where these air quality sensors come from. And I'm sure with AirQo at your university, you know all about this, but it's maybe worth spending a few minutes talking about this. So what's the advantages of these small sensors? So they're cheap, relatively cheap. So they're certainly cheap to buy, or they can be cheap to buy. So their capital costs are relatively cheap. And then there's operating costs as well. So that's where it gets a little bit ambiguous how cheap they are. So if I've bought this thing for $100, but then I employ a research fellow for the next year to use it, maybe they're not so cheap. So we do have to worry about that side of things. But it is cheaper than bigger equipment. Really important is they're small, low power, and typically there's relatively low technical expertise to buy something off the internet, press go. It might not give you great information, but you can at least get some measurements. And with these advantages, then you get all these new applications. So you get this greater spatial resolution, which we've seen from the AirQo data. We've got this greater temporal resolution, which we see from the AirQo data. We can start to think about having these things as mobile devices. So not just measuring at single locations, but actually putting them on the back of cars, putting them on other transport routes, maybe even putting them on yourself so you can really map your way around the city. We can think about sacrificial devices, not so relevant here, but I've done work in the past where we've looked at volcano emissions. And volcanoes are dangerous places. And so if you lose a sensor and it only cost £100, $100, that's not such a big problem. If it cost £500,000, then I'm going to get told off by my boss for sure. And I can go on, but we can do indoor monitoring as well, which again, with these old-fashioned big equipment, not only are they big and expensive, but they suck a lot of air through them. So if we were to monitor the air in this room with one of these bits of kit, they'd pull in so much air. There's an argument you're not actually measuring really what's in the room. You're measuring all the air it's pulling in from elsewhere because you're sucking too much air. These low-cost sensors have no real pull through of air, and so you can really measure indoors. So yes, lots of new applications, and it's really exciting. There's been this revolution, and there's lots of new things we can do with it. So this is just a figure of kind of the old-fashioned approach. So what we have here is we've got one monitoring station. This is just my pretend city. So we've got one monitoring station here, and we've got industry, we've got traffic, we've got actually pollution from greenery as well. We've got pollution in houses, but if we just have one monitoring station, if we're lucky, then that will tell us what the air pollution is here. And if we position it in a good place, then that's still useful. That tells us if we positioned it well and it's an urban background site, it tells us maybe what the average pollution is for the city. But with these low-cost sensors, we've suddenly got this possibility of putting sensors all around our city near different pollution sources. Maybe we put some on cars. Maybe in the future we can start to put them on drones and we can start rastering across the city. So lots and lots of ways that future technology or current technology can do these future applications. So it's a really exciting time to be working with these sensors. So I'll talk over this. So I talked about doing mobile measurements. So this is, your scene of boda bodas in Kampala. And so what we did, this is a few years ago, this was before COVID now, but what we did was we instrumented a few of these boda boda drivers. We put a sensor in the back there. And so as they drove around the city, picked up passengers, we could start to map out the city. And so that's one way you can start to do this source apportionment. So can you start to see where hotspots are in your city? And if you average, keep on averaging, do like certain areas really start coming out of the noise. So this is a figure. This is just a couple of examples. This was done in 2019. And what you can see is this is just one driver example. This is their routes through the city. It's colored. The hotter the color, the worse the air pollution is. And you can put that to a kind of a health-based metric. So essentially, if it's red, it's unhealthy. If it's green, it's healthy. Yellow and orange are in between. And purple down here, it's really unhealthy. And so what you can start to do is map out the city in this way. So that's a very crude way of doing source apportionment, but a way that you can do it. So I mentioned AirQo already, but again, another way you can do this air source apportionment is with these static sites. You can start to measure these different locations. And if this is just pulled off the website probably quite a few years ago now, so my apologies to DO for using out-of-date data. But maybe if this measurement here, this high one, this red one here, if that consistently is red and the rest of them aren't consistently red, you can start to get source information just by looking at how air pollution varies across the city. Is there hotspots? And so if there's a consistent hotspot, then that suggests that you can get sources through that. Relatively simple, but it gives you that idea. Okay, so source apportionment, we'll talk now. This is kind of the meat and bones of the talk, really. So successful air quality management and control not only requires measurements of air pollution levels, but it also requires information on the sources and their relative importance. That's what I said. So we've got all these different sources you told me about, but what's the most important one? If it turns out that transport is responsible for the vast majority of air pollution, then clearly that's where your government, that's where your regulators, that's where your politicians have to target their efforts. But until you can tell them this is where your air pollution is coming from, they won't necessarily do anything, okay? So you have to really give them this critical targeted information on pollution sources. Without that, it's difficult to pinpoint air pollution. Okay? And so like this story of air pollution sensors, historically, source apportionment has been done by expensive regulatory grade equipment. Again, we're going back to these really expensive bits of kit. And so there's great source apportionment work being done in universities around the world, really precise, really accurate. You can get a lot of information out of it. It's really expensive. And what it means is once it's really expensive, it just doesn't get done in the real world. And I'm not talking about Kampala here. I'm talking about Birmingham in the UK. I'm talking about other cities around the world. Even though we know how to do source apportionment, people don't do it. Okay. It's too expensive. It doesn't get done. It's not part of the regulatory toolkit. So this low-cost source apportionment project that I'm talking about, that's really my dream, is that we can make source apportionment at a price point where people can do it. And once you make it at that price point, people will do it. Okay. Whereas at the moment, there is the possibility of doing it, but people don't do it. Okay. So the question is, I guess, the open
Hello, sorry, Francis, we can't hear you anymore.
pollution, marine can be a big part, and we've got traffic pollution as well. So we got most of those when we talked about. And then if we can do a source apportionment, we can work out what's important. Okay. So that's what the pie chart. This is just an illustration. Okay. And also, if we start to worry about indoor air pollution, I won't talk much about indoor air pollution in this talk, but we can start to worry about the pollution inside our homes as well. So here it's a little bit more complicated because we can have outdoor air pollution coming in. So maybe we've got industrial pollution coming in, or maybe we've got vehicle pollution coming in, or maybe it's indoor sources. Excuse me. Like cooking inside the homes, or maybe it's resuspension of dust, still a pollutant, or it could be things like cleaning. And so again, we can start to think about how much air pollution is coming from outside, how much is it coming inside. And once you have this knowledge, that then gives you the options of how to reduce your air pollution exposure. So if most of the air pollution inside your house is coming from outside, then the obvious thing to do is try and stop it coming in and also purify your air. But if it turns out most of the pollution inside is coming from stuff you're doing indoors, then that suggests that you should be modifying behavior. Maybe you should be cooking with different fuel sources. Maybe you should be doing different types of cleaning procedures, etc. But it gives you that knowledge to make that change. Okay, so there's different ways you can do source apportionment. And historically or classically, and in the chemistry department, the way that you do it often is this chemical speciation. So you collect your sample of air pollution, and we'll talk about particulate matter today, but you collect your particulate matter, you gather it on a filter, and then you measure it analytically what's in there. And from that, you can tell where the pollution came from. So for an example, if you see a lot of iron, if you see a lot of minerals, then it's probably kind of deserty dust. If you see some more exciting metals, things like cerium, molybdenum, things like that, it's probably from vehicles because you get that from brake wear. So you can start to pinpoint, you can start to fingerprint where the pollution comes from. The trouble with that, though, it's expensive. So chemical speciation isn't really an option to do with sensors at this moment. But if any of you are looking for a project, which will have far-reaching consequences, is if you can come up with a sensor which measures composition, chemical composition at some level, even it doesn't have to be particularly precise, then that will get us a long way. I've often thought if you could do a fluorescence type, a low-cost fluorescence monitor, which should be relatively cheap to do, I think, in terms of a fluorescence monitor hasn't got so many components, then that would give you an awful lot of information. But that's all I'll say about chemical speciation now, because we can't, at the moment, until you invent it, we can't do it within sensors. So another way you can do source apportionment is you can use the size of particles as a indicator of where they come from. And so very simply, big particles, and by big I mean things which are about 10 microns in size, they tend to come from mechanical processes, things like kicking up dust, or from mining, or from quarrying, or when people bang stuff or rub stuff, you get this sort of mechanical abrasion. And then the smaller stuff often comes from combustion, and then the really small stuff comes from when gases turn into particles. And so you can see, you can start to speciate where these particles come from, or where their sources come from, just by looking at that size distribution. We'll look at that a bit more in a few. So we can definitely do that with some of the sensors, not the lowest cost sensors, but some of the sensors give us this information. I'll give you quite a few examples of that as we go through. We can do, if we've got an air pollution signal going through time, if we've got a relatively high resolution time signal, we can start to think about how does that pollution signal vary over time, okay? And very simply, if you've got a high resolution signal on there, that's going to likely be a local source, okay? So if we measure the air pollution next to that road, and if we've got a fast response monitor, you know, and by fast response, you want something that's measuring at least every second, then if you've got something measuring at least every second, you'll see as a car goes past and you'll see a spike, and then it'll go down, then you wait for the next car, and there'll be a spike in air pollution. So you can start to do that source apportionment using that temporal trend within there. Similarly, or counter to that, if you've got really long, slow moving signals, then it's likely a regional source of air pollution. And so there's various ways you can deconvolute these signals. So you can, in frequency space, I won't go into the details here, but Fourier transform, that type of approach, you can start to disaggregate different sources using that temporal profile. And then the other way you can do it is, it's fallen off the bottom of the screen here, but the other way I've already talked about a little bit is if you measure in different locations and you see hotspots, then you can start to do it that way. Okay. So if you're interested in general in this low-cost source apportionment, or LoCoSA, Dimitrios, who was going to be here but is now out in the field, so he recently first authored this review article. So this goes around all the background of how source apportionment can be done with low-cost sensors. And this was work funded by the UK Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs before. So it's nice, actually, this project, this new project, has also got DEFRA involved as well. But yeah, this has got all the information from what I've been talking about here. Okay, so maybe the simplest approach to doing source apportionment, so this is what's called a Lenschow type approach. And this is some data from Kenya from a few years ago. This is in Nairobi. So the simplest way, and we've done it before, is you can measure in just 3 locations. Okay, so you can measure, if you're going to measure in your city, you measure outside your city, upwind of your city, so where the air comes from before it hits your city. And then you can measure an urban background location within your city, so often on the top of the building, away from local sources, but within your city, and then measure next to where you think the pollution source might be. And so that will often be the roadside source. And so that's what we've got here, is we've got 3 monitors. This is just averaged diurnally, so averaged on the day. So this is just from midnight to midnight. And if we look at the roadside location in the red here, is you see this very clear rush hour peak in the morning and this longer rush hour peak in the afternoon. Okay. And then if you look at the urban background, pollution reduces, but you can still see that the urban background sees the rush hour. And then you go to the rural upwind source. There's actually still a little bit of rush hour there, but that's essentially how clean your air is before it gets into your city. And then you've got this increment as you go from outside the city to the kind of the general urban background. And then if you're next to the road, you can already see there's this huge increment in there. So in terms of your workforce in Kampala, you must think about, feel sorry for your boda drivers, for your traffic policemen and women, etc., because they're going to be, their working day is going to be in the thick of this all day long. Okay, whereas here in this nice green campus, we're probably here. Okay, not perfect, but certainly better. Okay. So the lens shower approach, we can just think about it here. So it's very simple. It's this incremental. We have background, and then we have an urban background, and then within the urban background, there's these spikes on top. And whether that's roads, whether that's industry, and we can do that approach. That's probably the simplest way we can do source apportionment, but we can do it with sensors, low-cost sensors, and so that gives us great power. We can complicate it as we put more and more sensors in there. We can start thinking about how different types of land use affects the pollution, and we can start setting up these land use regression models, but essentially it still boils down to this lens shower type approach. That's one way you can do source apportionment. And certainly that's how we will do it in part for this new project, this GAHP and ODA funded project. Okay, so another way we've done a lot in Birmingham, we'll also do a bit of this in this project, is we use this size distribution of particles. And so particles have this characteristic size distribution. So this is just a measurement. This is just a measurement from University of Birmingham. And again, this is done with a regulatory grade equipment. So this is measuring from 10 nanometers, so really, really small, up to 10 microns, so pretty big. And that's the size of particles for health we're pretty much interested in, okay? And if we look in terms of the number of particles, that's the black line, what you can see is the number of particles is really dominated by the small size of particles, okay? But because we're spanning orders of magnitude in size, if we then look at the volume of particles, this is for the same set of particles, what you see is the volume actually scales much more with the size of the particles, okay? And what you see is these bumps and wiggles, whether we look in the number distribution or whether we look in the volume distribution, what we can see is there's characteristic sizes in here, and it's those characteristic sizes we can use, say, where the particles come from, where their sources are. And so that's a fairly traditional approach to source apportionment with regulatory grade equipment. But one of the questions we asked ourselves a few years ago is, could we use sensors to do this same sort of analysis? And the answer is yes, and quite successfully. So this is just the same graph again. So as I said earlier, so in very broad terms, small particles, this end of the spectrum, they tend to come from nucleation. Really small particles comes from nucleation from gas phase. Gases sticking together to make particles, so that gives you nucleation particles, which is this end. And then you tend to get into the combustion particles about here, about this size. And then by the time you get out here, this is really this mechanical abrasion, things like vehicles kicking up dust, brake wear, tire wear, people sweeping, industrial processes, etc., quarrying. So the question we asked ourselves a few years ago is, can we... So this is the size that sensors can measure. So the whole size range, big expensive bits of kit like this, we can measure the whole size range. But with sensors, and these aren't the cheapest sensors either. These are something called optical particle counters will do this, but they will give you size information in this range. And so the question we asked ourselves is there enough information in this red square area to really say anything about source apportionment? And the answer is yes. Going forward, there's actually a range of new sensors coming out which tells us something about this size range really low. So it tells us something about the number of particles, and because number of particles is really talking about the small particles, you can start to get some information about this range as well. We haven't done much work there, but that's something we will look at in the future. Okay, so a lot of this work we've been doing has been using these optical particle counters. And they measure from about 0.4 microns up to 40 microns. So they don't get that small stuff. So they don't have that really fine information. But the nice thing about these sensors is they measure in about 40 different size bins. So you get a measurement from 0.3 to 0.4 microns, 0.4 to 0.5 microns, etc., etc. These aren't the cheapest sensors. They cost about, the actual sensor costs about $400. And if you're going to buy a commercial package, someone who's boxed them up, made it nice, they talk to the cloud, etc., then you're looking at about $4,000. So, you know, it's stretching the definition of low-cost sensors at this point. But still very useful and still orders of magnitude cheaper than buying the big regulatory equipment. Okay. And then for the source apportionment, there's various algorithmic ways you can take this data from the sizes of particles and then start thinking about how to, how you can start decomposing that information into sources. So we typically use something called PMF, or positive matrix factorization, or another version of it is called non-negative matrix factorization. And if you can tell me what the difference between positive and non-negative is, I'd like to know. But essentially what you do is you split it into source contributions and source profiles. You do this algorithmic approach. It's like a clustering type algorithm, really. And then it tells you what sources you have and in what parts of the day they're around. Okay. How much longer do I have left, would you say? I can speak all day, but I've been talking for about 35 minutes. So it's about 10, 15 minutes. Okay. I'll give a few examples. Okay. So this is one example of doing this type of approach. This is a construction site. This is the biggest construction site in Birmingham, where I'm from at the moment. So this is they're building a new train station. It's an absolutely massive site. This is a couple of kilometers wide by about a kilometer. So really big. And so we use these sensors. So the sensors is used up here. And so we measure the air pollution concentration, but we also measure the size of the air pollution. And from this, we can get 4 factors out. So this is the size, the different size of these 4 factors, okay? So we can see there's one factor has got this small particle, and then the other factors have slightly bigger particles. So we've got this from this PMF. And then what we can do is once we've deconvolved it into these different factors, we can then have the time series of these different factors. And then it turns into a bit of a logic problem. So then you have to scratch your head and think about, well, when did this factor, what does it correlate with? Does it look like just urban pollution? Does it look like the time of the day where the construction workers start? Does it look like it comes from this industrial source? So that's the sort of the magic in it, not necessarily the science, but you have to do that logic problem. So working out where those factors come from. And what you can do is we managed to split this in this particular example. We can look at it as urban background, so general pollution from your city. And then there's regional background coming in from further away. And then factors 3 and 4, these ones at the bottom here, they were from construction site activities. And if we look at the diaries, or when we did look at the diaries of the construction, you know, when they started, what days they were working, etc., then it corresponded perfectly to these time series. Okay, so you can really pull out these sources very nicely. It takes a little bit of thought to make sure you understand it, but you can get some very strong information out. Take a sip of water. And this is starting to have some commercial and regulatory impacts in the UK. So we did this work with a company called Duscan, and they do the monitoring for construction sites and quarry sites. And so now you're getting to very useful information. And the most exciting bit here is actually now you can tell construction sites that you are responsible for this much pollution, whereas in the past they could hide and say, well, you're just measuring air pollution. You know, some of it will be us, but you don't know how much of it is us. But now we can say, actually, you're responsible for X% of it. And by law, you're only allowed to produce this much. Yeah. Whereas before they couldn't be monitored. So now you've suddenly got a regulatory lever that you can get these industries with. So I think, you know, that's really, really powerful. And then this is just more examples from this. I'll move on to not labor this point too much. So another example of this, again, this is in Birmingham. So what we have here is the University of Birmingham here. And the students live in this area called Selly Oak. So it's just a residential area to the south of it. And so our students typically walk from where they live and they take different routes to walk there to get to the university, okay? And so we had, we put air pollution monitors in these different houses. And the question is could we, how many students or citizen scientists, because they did it for free, they wanted to help out, they wanted to know, how many of these do you need? This is with mobile monitors. So how many of these people do you need to really understand the whole of this area? So obviously if everyone in the whole 10,000 people in this whole area all had their own sensor, then you'd know it very well, but that gets quite expensive. So how many people do you need to do, how many people do you need to be able to understand what the air pollution of this whole area is? Okay. And so what we did was we gave a certain number of our citizen scientists stroke students, we gave them backpacks and they had mobile air pollution sensors in them. Okay. And then we also supplemented this with static locations. And so the good thing about if you've got it in your backpack, you get good spatial information, but not necessarily, you're not going to be at the same spot at the same time each day. So statistically, it's a bit difficult to say exactly what that means. Whereas if you've got static locations, then you've got single locations. Yes, you don't get that spatial information, but you know exactly how the time signature works. You know how the air pollution varies over time. So that combination of both static and mobile sensors is really powerful. And so what we could do is we could map the whole of this Selly Oak area. This is looking at PM10, and this is just showing where the hotspots were within this. So this is using the data from the people walk around and the static sensors. Where are the hotspots within here? Ooh, it's not moved on, has it? Just trying to get back. So it's stuck there. Why is that stuck there? Okay, I think, oh. I think there's a bit of a lag between the, I think there's just a bit of a lag between this and this, but it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Okay, so what we could then do is you could look at doing this source apportionment as well. And what you could start to find out is you'd get hotspots, and it turned out you'd have hotspots where there was construction, where there was traffic. So this traffic lights just shows where there was hotspots there and the construction sites. So you could start to map out the city. And so these citizen scientists, it turns out that we only needed about 4 people. So we looked at the variance, how many people we had in there. It turned out you only needed 4 people for 10,000 people in this instance. And from that, you could map out the whole area of what the air pollution looked like. So I won't talk about this too much, but using kind of these modern machine learning techniques, what you can then do is you put in the information from those 4 mobile measurements. You can put and add in some additional information like meteorology and the static sites. And what you can do is then predict what the air pollution is for the whole area. And actually, that worked pretty well. So it turns out if the University of Birmingham or Birmingham City Council was willing to pay 4 people to have these low-cost sensors in their backpacks, then we could understand the whole of the air pollution for this area. So it's quite a scalable solution. So we can get quite, well, very powerful source apportionment by doing that. Okay, so I won't do too many more examples. I'll just give one more example, but an indoor example here. So something we've done a lot of work on is looking at school environments. Again, the reasons for looking at school environments are obvious. So children, learning, education outcomes, etc. So this was a school in Wales, but we've done similar work in Nigeria. And so here what we did was we looked at classrooms, 3 classrooms in the school. It doesn't really matter what the classrooms are, but one was English, one was a religious studies classroom, and one was a cooking classroom. Okay. And we did the same thing. We monitored the air pollution within the classrooms. And the really neat thing about this study, it's just a relatively short study. It was only a 2-week study. But the nice thing about this was for the first week, the students were at school. And for the second week, it was school holidays. So we got this very clear how much air pollution is due to the students being in school and how much of the air pollution is just due to the outdoor air coming in. Okay. And you can see straight away, this is for, we're just looking at PM 2.5. So particles below 2.5 microns. And what we can see is these are for the 3 different classrooms. First thing to notice before we even think about the colors is that it's very clear that during school time, there's more pollution. So there's something about children just being in the classrooms, which is creating pollution, okay? Because when we get to this bit outside of it, it's much cleaner, okay? And so then we do the source apportionment on top, and we start to look at how much of the air pollution from the sources, is it indoor sources of air pollution, and how much is it from outdoor sources of pollution? And what we can see, if it's indoor generated, it's red, and if it's outdoor generated, it's black. And what we can see is actually it's really the action of the students being in the classroom. They're kicking up dust. They're doing activities which generate pollution. It's all as bad for you as each other. And so what that says is actually this school should be looking at ways to reduce the air pollution from indoor. So they need greater filtration or they need more air coming through the building. So you can start to get to really practical steps of how to deal with this. So that was a nice example. As I say, we've done similar work to this in Nigeria as well. And that's, yeah, I'll just say a few words, I think, at the end. So what this new project is, so the new project is called Source Apportionment of Traffic-Related Air Pollution, or TRAP, so Traffic-Related Air Pollution, TRAP, in Kampala, Uganda. And so the idea of this new project is to use this low-cost source apportionment, or this LoCoSA. So this is using these sensors to do source apportionment and to identify and understand the dominant sources of Kampala's air pollution, and with a specific focus on quantifying the contributions from traffic-related air pollution. So doing that, so we can, at the end of the project, we'll get those pie charts for different locations in the city. So is it transport? Is that the dominant pollutant, or is it something else? Is it regional background? Is it industries, etc.? And we'll be able to give that information. So we'll just study distinct locations within Kampala. So we'll look at roadside sites versus urban background sites in particular. Then with this information, both the information on how much air pollution there is in total, and that's data from AirQo. We don't need to do that because they're doing such a good job there. And then from the source apportionment, we can say how much of that air pollution, so if we've got this much air pollution, how much of it is to do with transport? Maybe it's half, maybe it's 3/4, who knows? We'll find that out, okay? And then once we have that information, we can do the health calculation. So this level of air pollution, how unhealthy is it? What's the effects on the body? What's the cause on life expectancy, etc.? And then using the source apportionment, we can then say, well, the transport-related pollution is responsible for this much of it, and hence, in terms of the effect on health, it's responsible for this much. And if it turns out that the number is low, then that suggests that Kampala Capital City Authority doesn't need to do anything about transport pollution. I don't think that's going to be true. I suspect it's going to be quite high. But the information we'll be able to give them is how high it is, and that will give them a relative ranking of the importance of it. And then we'll be able to look at further relationships of how different parts of the city compare to each other. And so this is a picture of Dimitrios, who sadly isn't here, but that's him and Dio Okedi putting up sensors yesterday. So they're very much in the setting up, getting things working side of the project. So really exciting. I'll be back here later in the year, hopefully. I don't know exactly when, but hopefully if I'm invited back, Prof, then I can give you an update on that. And I think with that, I'll skip over this. That's just a bit of fun if I had more time, but I don't. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll take any questions if you have any. Thank you.
We thank you very much for what you did us. And we're going to welcome comments. We have our online participants. Moses, you can look at comments from our online participants, but also invite comments from within the room. If you want to give a comment or a question, raise up your hand. We have a microphone there. Yeah, we can start with you state your name briefly and then
Thanks, Prof. My name is Job. Just a quick one. So I understand you set up all these low-cost sensors around. So do you think would they actually factor in the wind direction, wind speed, and all that? Because I would imagine that actually have a big effect on where the pollution is coming from. I just wanted to know.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I've got a slide somewhere which I brushed over. Where is it? Yeah, so these polar plots, these ones here, what this does is show where the pollution is as a function of wind speed and wind direction. So if you've got a hot spot here, for example, it means that when the wind is blowing from the east and it's blowing quite hard, then you see more pollution. So again, already you can start to, and then that's just with one sensor. So you can imagine if you've got 3 sensors, then you can start to triangulate. So if you had an industrial unit there and you put a sensor in front of it, sensor behind it, and then just by knowing which way the wind blew, you can start to triangulate sources. So that's another way of doing this source apportionment. Yeah, absolutely.
So, transportation sources, will you be able to determine which type of category of vehicles, because we have these borders, we have these are different. Is that something that you'll be able to get from the data? Thanks.
That's the tough one. What you might be able to do is some vehicles. We've got some vehicles are very high polluters, right? So most vehicles, you don't see the or then every now and then you see one that goes past with this big black plume. And so I suspect we would be able to differentiate that from an average vehicle, but that can be, this is separate work to what I've been saying here, but what we've done in previous work is we've looked at the effect of high emitters vehicles on the total pollution. And what you find, at least in Birmingham, is you've got about 10% of the fleet is responsible for 80% of the pollution. And so in terms of a policy point of view, one thing you could do very effectively is target high emitters, because I suspect the same is true for Kampala. I don't know, I haven't got data, but I suspect the same is true. So if you really targeted those high emitters and stopped those heavy smokers, then you would reduce pollution pretty quickly. And it will only be 5–10% of the fleet, I'm sure. So,
for our participants online, please input your question or comment in the chat, and then we shall pass them over to Prof to answer them. Dr. Kasozi?
Yes, thank you, Pop. Gabriel is my name. Out of curiosity, I wanted to find out from your data that you presented regarding the construction site. What were your input parameters and how you estimated the errors? Because I suppose from what I saw that you're using the PM 2.5, the PMF model. And just wanted to find out what were your input parameters so you could be able to estimate the sources for the soil.
Yeah, so we're using the size bins of the particles. So we measure from 0.3 microns up to 40 microns, but in reality, the interesting bits were about 0.3 to 10. And within that, we've got maybe, off the top of my head, I think 15 size bins. So the first size bin will be 0.3 to 0.4 microns, 0.4, next one will be 0.4 to 0.5 microns. And so whilst it's a continuum, you've got that information, the shape of the size profile. The PMFD convolutes that size profile into the different components which make up the whole of the size, if you see what I mean. So, and what you find is the construction particles tend to be bigger with a characteristic size, whereas, say, the traffic pollution is smaller, also with a characteristic size. And so what the PMF allows you to do, this is what the total size distribution looks like, which is constructed out of this much of the construction size, plus this much of the transport size, plus whatever other factors you've got in there. So we do it on the size distribution. So you can do it, the other way you can do it, or another way you can do it is using the chemical speciation, but we use the size of the particles as our input parameters.
How were you handling the uncertainties for the measurements?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where the magic in PMF comes as well, right? So do you have good uncertainty parameters for these? And so the honest answer there is you don't have very good uncertainty parameters for the different size bins, but you can assign uncertainty parameters just by looking at long-term trends and being able to look at what the variance is in there, so you can estimate it.
As we give Professor Pope 1 minute to take some water, there was a comment from South Africa where someone was asking about joining the Global Alliance on Health and Pollution. Maybe this one Maria Paula can handle briefly. Yeah, we can.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I will be brief because unfortunately I have to leave. But yes, I replied in the chat that membership is open to countries, also to university and other organizations. It's free of charge. I shared the link, which is our website, and you can visit. What we require is a form to fill, and then there is a membership committee which will look into the application. And if you meet the criteria of being a member, the process is really pretty straightforward. So I would be very happy if I receive requests from you and I share my address. And before I go, I'd like to thank Professor Tebandake for convening this, and of course Francis Pope for his excellent presentation. Very happy to hear from you, because I read the study, but hearing from you makes complete sense and gives very interesting information. So my question for you before I leave, if ideally we add more budget and more resources to invest in this study, do you think we should expand it to other areas of the city? And ideally, how many sensors would you need to really say to the government of Uganda, here in Kampala, what we are providing you so that you can make an informed decision and change your policy? Something for us to think. I don't know whether you could reply to this now. Maybe it's to think this through, but I invite you to do if you don't have a reply now.
Thank you, Maria Paula. I will ponder it. The typical scientific question is as many as you can afford, right? But we can optimize. I think, like I showed on the citizen science project, you know, it turned out actually having 4 mobile sensors gave us an awful lot of information. So what we can do in this initial phase is we can estimate for an area as big as Kampala. So let me get back to you on that. But I think expansion, what would be really interesting is to expand into different parts of Kampala and maybe the wider metropolitan region as well. But let me come back to you, and I'll talk to Dio as well, and we can give you a firm answer there, I'm sure.
Thank you. I have to leave, but I will be very pleased to explore this option.
Fantastic.
Thanks. I wish you a nice day in Kampala and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for that comment. We'll go to Dr. Patrick Sabgere.
Yes, thank you, Francis, for the wonderful talk. Mine is about the sensors versus their capability, because then these ones are meant for particulate matter and probably the heavy metals and simple gases like methane. Do they have the capabilities to sense the chemicals of emerging concerns like the PFAS, the PBDEs?
Simple answer is no, and that's because these pollutants like PFAS, etc. You know, you're talking about really small amounts, you know, parts per trillion type of levels. So there are some sensors for gas phase. So, for example, there's formaldehyde sensors. It really depends. So a lot of the gas sensors came out of industrial applications, you know, for monitoring dangerous pollutants in industrial applications. And so now they're filtering into air pollution studies. So, you know, so there's a lot of gas. So I guess the standard ones which are useful for air pollution is we can measure nitrogen oxides, both nitric oxide and nitrogen dioxide. We can measure ozone, as you say, methane, carbon dioxide, formaldehyde, and there's other ones. But in terms of these important organic molecules of which there's only a small, even though they're super important, there's only small concentrations, there isn't sensors. That's not to say that someone couldn't make a sensor that did it. As I said in the talk, personally, I think a good direction of travel would be to set up a fluorescence sensor, because they're very powerful, they're very, they got high detection rates. You know, it's not the most precise, because the fluorescent signal, as you know, is this broad fluorescence. So it's a bit difficult to get much information, but I think that would really give you more information about what organics and how high the organic fraction was in there. But it's certainly a future research project, I think.
Yes. But lastly, in the introductory remarks, you are talking about death due to air pollution being about 4 to 8 million people, right? Mm-hmm. And my hope these are not in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa.
Well, some of them
where
are,
basically?
I mean, certainly some of them are. So it's premature death. Air pollution is a slightly difficult one to define, right? So it's kind of a statistical death on the whole. There's unfortunate people who are very susceptible to air pollution, and they will die from respiratory problems, and that does happen. But for most of us, it's not a very dramatic death, but it does reduce the length of our lives, right? And that depends on how much air pollution there is. So in the UK, where there's about 67 million people, there's about 40,000 premature deaths per year because of air pollution. I don't know the exact numbers for Africa as a whole, but because your air pollution is higher, so then pro rata, you're going to have more deaths. So it's a very significant burden on the economy and on the population. As I say, you'll very rarely be able to say that this person died because of air pollution, because people die of a variety of diseases, right? But, you know, it's very much a very significant health factor, and it will make a big difference.
Maybe we got some questions from the chat. There's one which is to do with the scope. Maybe you can comment about the scope of the sensors. So Anthony is asking whether you can include NOx, SOx, and CO and PAH in the study.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, so to give you a bit of context, and this is my personal view, so that the particulate matter sensors are good. There's a few things you need to know about them to make them work well, but on the whole, they give you good data. And so lots of groups around the world, including my own, have spent a lot of time in the last decade making sure that these data from PM sensors is good, and so that's good. When it comes to the gas sensors, they're not as good. That's a slightly controversial thing to say, but that's my personal opinion, is they're not as good. But they do give you information. And so when we're talking about source apportionment, actually bringing in these gases is potentially going to be very helpful, and that's one of the things we're going to do in this project. So if we're trying to disaggregate, again, if we were talking about vehicle pollution in Kampala, then vehicle pollution would also expect there to be NOx pollution from the exhaust, would also expect there to be higher amounts of CO2, etc. So it's really useful information. So even though the data of the gases isn't of as high a quality as the particulate matter data, it still gives you more information to help you with those source apportionment algorithms. So I think it's super important, and they're only going to get better as well. So these gas phase sensors will get loads better as we move forward, I'm sure. So to answer the question directly, the study is using NOx, CO, and carbon dioxide within it. But we're using that information to help us understand the sources of particulate matter rather than worrying about the gas phase pollutants in themselves.
Maybe another comment, which is, how do you calculate uncertainties? I think in the reading. Maybe to add to that, you commented about calibration of sensors. Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe this could be related to that. In your talk, this is where you talk about calibration of sensors. So maybe you can throw some light on that.
Yeah, I don't know if, because there was a question about the AirQo sensors, and since Dio's in the audience, I don't know if he wants to respond to that himself. But if he's not there, I can certainly talk to it. So,
yeah, please do respond to what you can. There's what Deo responded in the chat.
Okay.
But, if you can respond to something, please do.
Yeah, so calibration of these sensors is a key thing. As I've said to the last question, actually, these PM sensors are pretty good already now. If you'd asked me that 5-10 years ago, I'd be much more, oh, you need to calibrate, you need to calibrate, you need to calibrate. But actually, they're getting pretty good. There's standards. But if we look at AirQo, they've got regulatory grade equipment to calibrate against, and they do a fine job of calibrating both within the field at their meteorological station here at Makerere, but also within the lab. So they've got these 2 calibration points. So they do a very good job of calibrating their equipment.
And maybe one other question is to do with this where you're commenting and then you're talking about colors. So is the sensors, is it qualitative or quantitative in terms of data output?
So I would argue, again, for the PM, quantitative. I mean, within error bars, right? But yeah, but certainly if you look at the PM data, I'd argue strongly they're quantitative and you can get good data from them. The gas phase sensors, I would argue that the data is maybe more qualitative at the moment. There'd be other people in the world who would, be spitting on the floor after I say that. But, from my personal opinion, the gas phase sensors aren't there yet.
More questions? One from Doreen.
Okay, thank you so much, Francis, for the presentation. I just wanted to get some understanding, probably if I missed it. The sensors, are they real-time connecting the data collected with a source, or it needs to collect the data for a certain period of time and then come and feed it into the PMF model?
The latter, yeah. So the dream is, well, let me answer the question, then I'll get to the dream. But yeah, so the air quality data is real-time or near real-time. The sensors project the data to the cloud, and you can get the data from the cloud, maybe 5-10 minutes later than reality. So that's in real time. But then to do the source apportionment algorithms, you then need a long-term data set to work on. So that's post hoc analysis at that point. So that's not in real time. So that's the true answer to that question. Now, the dream is that once you've set up the source apportionment algorithms, you could then run them also in the cloud. And as you get the new information in, you could then run the source apportionment just on that new bit, bearing in mind what came before. And I think that's possible. We haven't got there yet, but I think that would be, again, in terms of that, getting to that regulatory policy lever, I think that would be really powerful. So say you can, at a site, if you see your, your construction factor suddenly starts spiking in real time, then you could go straight away to your construction firm and say, actually, you need to do something now to reduce this. So I think that is the future, but we're not there yet.
I know the lecture is interesting, but we have to conclude. So we are looking at concluding questions now, yeah? A few hands, and then any other question? Okay, please.
Yes, thank you, Professor Prof, for the presentation. Mine's about that for example, the industrial parks or the industries, they have, like, they can emit gases that are quite, let's say, mist, like very thick. Can that cause corrosion of the sensors? And is there any strategy to mitigate that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I saw there was something somewhat similar in the, what's the lifetime of these sensors, and does their output change by how, as you say, how they corrode? Yeah, so the gas phase sensors certainly have the potential to corrode. They're essentially these electrochemical sensors, and if you're oxidizing them over time, then the sensor will go off. The particulate matter sensors, what you tend to get is they just get dust on them, really. So the sensors gets a layer of grime on top of them, and so they do have a lifetime. And you see it in more polluted places, the sensors last less time. And that's something the industry, as in the low-cost sensor industry, is beginning to get better about in terms of making sure that the sensors are more modular, as in, so once the sensor goes down, it's not a question of just throwing the whole thing out. You can just replace the little bit of it, but it's not quite there yet. But that's something that needs to happen, and I think, again, that's the direction of travel, is people are putting a lot of thought into how long these things last for, and can you actually diagnose when they're degrading, and that's quite difficult, right? So is the signal going down because your air pollution is less, or is it because your sensor's degrading? And that's actually more difficult than you'd think, but yeah, it's an important point.
Maybe not to put you on the spot, there is a comment from Janine from University of Pretoria, and is asking, in terms of capacity building, where there are chances for where you can have free online summer schools for training. Mm-hmm. I suppose this is mainly for students.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great idea, and as I say, this was pretty much unashamedly a science talk today, but you know, I can give a similar talk to what needs to happen with respect to policy, with respect to education. But yeah, I think free online summer schools would be perfect, and that'd be something I'd be keen to do. So please, Janine, do get in contact.
Okay, I think that's good, because I know in a way GAHP kind of try to promote exchange, especially for students, and I know they're actually going to bring some instructional materials for our department here. So student leaders, I think next week, they intend to bring us some materials, game boards for training. So I think if there's any opportunity for support, I think they can support us in that aspect. Hey, you already gave your comment, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, he has been responding, and then he generated more curiosity from my side. So I have one or two. A quick one. Now, this particle size, is it a volume average or surface average? Which one is that?
So typically we either look at number averaged or volume averaged. Yeah. In terms of the algorithms, it's an interesting question, because in terms, you know, there's no new information whether you're looking at the size, the volume, or the number, right? Yeah. But if you look at the volume, you're putting greater weight on the bigger particles, and if you're looking at the number, you're putting greater weight on the smaller particles. So there's that balancing in there, you know, even though you're not actually, you're not providing any more information. So within the source apportionment, you can do either volume or number, but in reality, it doesn't make a huge difference, because you still get the bumps and wiggles. It's just more prominent in the volume.
Okay.
I think the questions are exhausted. Ladies and gentlemen, let us put our hands together to thank Professor Prof. For all our participants online, we thank you for your attention and your participation in this lecture. Yeah, thank you all, and have a blessed day. For us who are here, we have a cup of coffee, cup of tea, or some water. We didn't want to interrupt the lecture, but we have some few logistics. You're welcome to enjoy with Prof. Francis.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Yeah, good turnout.